They laughed together when the cameras were gone and the noise of the world faded away. They leaned on each other when life behind palace walls and stage lights became too heavy to bear. Yet even in that closeness, there was a silence, an unspoken truth buried beneath years of fame, heartbreak, and misunderstanding. For decades, Elton John guarded that silence like a wound that never healed, carrying memories too painful to revisit and too sacred to forget. Now, with time softening the sharpest edges of loss, he finally lets the truth surface. The truth about his bond with Princess Diana, a friendship that began in laughter, weathered fame, and ended in tragedy. Behind every smile they shared lay a story of love, loyalty, and regret, and for the first time, Elton John is ready to confess what really happened between the Rocket Man and the people's princess. Now, after decades of silence, Elton John is finally ready to share the story that changed both of their lives forever, the night they met. It was the summer of 1981, a season drenched in excitement and royal anticipation. Britain was preparing for the wedding of the century, Prince Charles and the shy young nursery teacher Diana Spencer. The streets buzzed with celebration, the media overflowed with images of love and promise, and the entire world watched as history prepared to unfold. But for Elton John, who was already one of the most famous musicians on earth, that summer would mark not just a royal milestone, but the beginning of one of the most meaningful friendships of his life. By then, Elton had become a familiar face within royal circles. The Queen Mother adored his music. Princess Margaret, known for her mischievous spirit, often invited him to intimate gatherings at Kensington Palace. He had performed for aristocrats, dined with dukes, and even joked with Prince Philip, who once teased him about his bright yellow Aston Martin roaring around Windsor. Yet, for all the opulence surrounding him, Elton never truly felt like he belonged. Fame had given him access, but not comfort. That feeling changed one unforgettable evening inside the grand ballroom of Windsor Castle, Prince Andrew's 21st birthday. The castle shimmered with chandeliers and royalty. Every corner sparkled with jewels, uniforms, and formality. Elton, dressed humbly by his usual flamboyant standards, took his place at the piano, playing softly as the elite murmured and laughed over champagne. He later confessed he felt strangely nervous, out of place among so many titled strangers. But then something shifted. Across the room, a young woman entered, her presence soft yet commanding, her smile bright enough to outshine the crystal chandeliers. It was Diana Spencer, not yet a princess, but already radiating the magic that would capture the world. The air itself seemed to pause. Elton looked up from the piano, and for a moment their eyes met. She smiled, not the polished smile of royalty, but a warm human smile that melted the stiffness of the room. Elton smiled back, and within minutes they were talking like lifelong friends. They laughed about the awkward music selection and soon found themselves miming the Charleston together in the middle of the ballroom, two rebels sharing a private joke amid royal tradition. The Queen herself glanced over and smiled, amused by the sight of the future Princess of Wales and the world's most flamboyant musician twirling like carefree children under the chandeliers. Elton would later write in his autobiography, "Me. That night I felt as though I'd known her forever." For Diana, that laughter was a breath of fresh air before the weight of duty came crashing down. She was just weeks away from stepping into a life where every movement, every word, every glance would be dissected and judged. For Elton, she was a revelation, unpretentious, genuine, wickedly funny, and full of compassion. She was fabulous company, he remembered fondly. The best dinner guest. Incredibly indiscreet, a real gossip. But she cared deeply about people. From that evening on, something unspoken bound them together. They were both outsiders in their own worlds, two icons adored by millions, yet constantly misunderstood by those closest to them. Where Diana brought warmth to a cold institution, Elton brought sincerity to a world of illusion. In each other they found understanding, humor, and the rare kind of friendship that survives beyond fame, beyond grief, and beyond time itself. He was the flamboyant musician forever under the spotlight, scrutinized for every lyric, every outfit, every part of who he was. She was the young woman about to surrender her freedom to one of the most rigid institutions on earth. Somehow, in that glittering ballroom, they recognized each other's loneliness. Without judgment or pretense, they saw the pain behind each other's smiles, and that silent understanding, born out of laughter and empathy, became the foundation of one of the most remarkable friendships of the 20th century. Neither of them could have known then that their connection would end in tragedy, or that one day Elton's voice would carry the final farewell for them both. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, their bond only deepened, even as the cameras captured their every move. To the world, they were icons, symbols of glamour and fame, but behind the flashbulbs was a friendship built on honesty, vulnerability, and an unwavering trust. They attended charity galas, royal functions, and concerts together, always smiling for the photographers, but what the world didn't see were the private moments, the phone calls, the letters, the quiet confessions shared away from the crowds. Elton often said that Diana possessed a rare gift. She could make the most powerful people in the world feel at ease. And yet, she herself rarely felt at peace. Behind the palace gates, Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was beginning to fracture. Whispers of betrayal, affairs, and emotional distance filled the tabloids, but behind those headlines was a young woman trapped between duty and despair. The palace expected perfection, but what Diana craved was warmth, connection, and understanding, things she rarely received within those cold, gilded walls. Elton understood that kind of loneliness all too well. Behind his stage lights and flamboyant costumes, he too battled his demons, addiction, exhaustion, and the constant pressure of being publicly dissected. Their friendship became a quiet refuge from all that noise, a place where they didn't need to pretend. In each other, they found courage. Diana's compassion inspired Elton. Elton's resilience encouraged Diana. Their bond was more than friendship. It was survival. She began supporting his charity efforts, especially those tied to AIDS awareness, a cause that united their spirits. At a time when AIDS carried fear and stigma, Diana broke royal protocol by visiting hospitals, shaking hands, and embracing patients with compassion. Elton would later say that her simple act of touch changed the world's perception of the disease. That moment, he said, showed how fearless she was. She didn't care about image. She cared about people. And amid the darkness, there were still moments of joy. Diana's mischievous sense of humor matched Elton's flamboyant sparkle perfectly. She teased him about his outrageous stage outfits, joking that he was the only man who could outshine a royal ball gown, while he admired her wit and courage in the face of scrutiny. At private parties, they would laugh uncontrollably, sharing inside jokes that cut through the formality of royal life. Elton loved that about her, her ability to be real in a world obsessed with appearances. For both of them, laughter wasn't just an escape. It was a form of healing. Together, they defied expectation. Two souls from utterly different worlds bound by empathy and rebellion. He was the showman who dared to be himself, and she was the princess who dared to be human. And though tragedy would one day end their story far too soon, what they built during those years, the honesty, the laughter, the compassion, would outlast them both, echoing long after the music stopped and the crown was laid to rest. Wherever they went, attention followed like a shadow. The friendship between Elton John and Princess Diana wasn't just adored. It was watched, dissected, and magnified until every smile became a headline. Even the most private gatherings couldn't escape chaos. One evening at a quiet dinner party in London, both Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone found themselves competing for Diana's attention. What began as playful flirtation quickly turned into tension. Elton, who witnessed the scene firsthand, later joked that the two Hollywood titans were on the verge of throwing punches over her. They were utterly bewitched, he wrote, laughing at how effortlessly Diana could disarm even the most confident men in the room. She didn't seek admiration, it simply followed her everywhere she went. But beneath the sparkle of every glamorous night, Diana's private world was unraveling. Behind the charm and laughter was a woman drowning in loneliness. She battled bulimia, insomnia, and a deep ache for love that fame and duty could never satisfy. There were nights when Elton would visit her simply to listen. No cameras, no gossip, no royal formality, just two friends seeking refuge from the noise. Those were the moments that kept them grounded. But as the world's obsession with Diana grew, the walls around her tightened. The pressures of the palace, the manipulation of courtiers, and the endless scrutiny of the media began to wear her down. Elton, who knew what it meant to live under constant exposure, worried for her. He could see the toll it was taking, the exhaustion behind her smiles, the fragility hidden beneath her laughter. By the early 1990s, their relationship had grown into something like family. They teased each other endlessly, confided their fears, and occasionally argued like siblings. But fame, pride, and fatigue have a way of straining even the strongest bonds. And soon, one misunderstanding would turn into a painful rift neither of them could forget. By the mid-1990s, the friendship between Elton John and Princess Diana had become the stuff of legend, a rare connection between royalty and celebrity, built on authenticity and affection. They had survived tabloid storms together, stood united through scandal, and proven that compassion could thrive even under the harshest lights. Yet in 1996, something changed. What began as a gesture of goodwill spiraled into silence. Elton had been working on a charity project close to his heart, a coffee table book of rock photography, a vivid celebration of music, art, and culture. Every page carried images of icons and legends, and all proceeds were to benefit his AIDS Foundation. When Diana agreed to write the foreword, it wasn't just a friendly favor. It was a symbol. The princess, who had risked criticism to hold the hands of AIDS patients, was lending her name to a cause that defined both compassion and courage. For Elton, her involvement meant the world. It was validation. Not from a royal figure, but from a friend who truly understood why the project mattered. Then suddenly, everything changed. A letter arrived from Kensington Palace, polite yet distant. Diana was withdrawing. She thanked Elton for including her, but explained she could no longer participate. No reason was given, but soon the truth reached him. Buckingham Palace had intervened. Royal advisors had deemed the book inappropriate, objecting to a few photographs featuring semi-nude male models. The idea of a royal name being attached to such material was, in their eyes, unacceptable. To Elton, the decision felt like betrayal, not from the palace, but from Diana herself. He understood royal protocol, but what hurt was the silence that followed, the absence of the honesty that had always defined their friendship. Years later, on Larry King Live, he would admit, "I wasn't too happy, and I let her know that." It wasn't anger for the project. It was heartbreak over the distance that had suddenly appeared between them. The woman who had once danced with him in defiance of judgment was now forced to choose formality over friendship. It was the first real fracture in a bond that had seemed unbreakable, a reminder that even the strongest connections can falter under the weight of fame, fear, and the invisible chains of royal expectation. And though neither of them knew it at the time, that silence would last until tragedy brought them back together, one final time, beneath the shadow of grief and a song that would echo around the world. He sent her a message, short but heavy with disappointment. For all the years of honesty between them, it was one of the few times Elton John let his frustration show. Diana, already feeling cornered by the pressures of her collapsing world, responded with what he later described as a tart letter, sharp, distant, and final. The warmth that had once defined their friendship was suddenly gone. After that exchange, there was only silence. For months, they didn't speak. What hurt Elton most wasn't her decision to withdraw from the project. It was the emotional distance that followed. The woman who had once been his confidant now felt like a stranger, swallowed by the world she had fought so hard to survive. Meanwhile, Diana was enduring one of the most turbulent periods of her life. Her divorce from Prince Charles had just been finalized in August 1996. She had lost not only her title, Her Royal Highness, but also a vital part of her identity. The institution she had married into had cast her out, and the press hounded her day and night, documenting her every move with merciless precision. Surrounded by advisors, opportunists, and whispers of betrayal, she began to question everyone around her. Trust became a luxury she could no longer afford. Elton suspected that palace advisors had influenced her withdrawal, steering her away from anything that might stir controversy. Yet in his quieter moments, he also wondered whether Diana was simply exhausted, tired of always being a symbol, tired of carrying other people's causes when she barely had the strength to carry her own. Whatever the reason, the damage had been done. Two people who had once shared laughter, grief, and secrets about the monarchy were suddenly worlds apart. It was awful, Elton later admitted. We'd always been honest with each other, but pride got in the way. He confessed that he could have called her, but didn't. We were both too proud, he said quietly, and before we could fix it, it was too late. For nearly a year, the silence stretched on, an unspoken sadness haunting both their lives. Behind the scenes, Elton buried himself in his work, raising millions for his AIDS foundation. Diana, stripped of her royal role, began reinventing herself as a humanitarian, finding new purpose through her charity work and global compassion. Yet beneath the surface of both their lives lay the same quiet ache, the regret of a friendship left unresolved. Neither could have imagined that fate was already preparing to pull them back together under the most tragic of circumstances. July 15, 1997, their worlds collided again in grief. Italian fashion designer Gianni Versace, a close friend to both Elton and Diana, was shot dead outside his Miami Beach mansion. The shocking news rippled through the fashion and entertainment world, leaving both of them devastated. Versace had been one of Diana's closest confidants. She had modeled one of his gowns for Harper's Bazaar in 1991 and often described him as one of the few people who understood her spirit. To Elton, Versace was more than a designer. He was family, a man who celebrated individuality in a world obsessed with conformity. When Diana heard the news, she reportedly turned to her bodyguard and asked, "Do you think they'll do that to me?" It was a chilling question, one that revealed just how aware she was of her own vulnerability. Within weeks, that haunting thought would prove prophetic. At Versace's funeral in Milan, grief hung heavy in the air. The Grand Cathedral was filled with the world's most powerful and famous faces, all united in shock and mourning. Elton sat quietly among them, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, his expression pale and hollow. And then through the sea of black veils and cameras came Diana. She spotted him sitting alone. They hadn't spoken in months, but she walked straight toward him without hesitation. Reaching out, she took his hand gently and whispered, "I'm so sorry. It was silly our falling out. Let's be friends again." In that moment, the silence between them shattered. Elton later said the gesture moved him more deeply than words could express. It wasn't just an apology. It was forgiveness, a reunion sealed not by grandeur but by shared pain. And in true Diana fashion, before the heaviness of grief could consume them both, she found a way to lighten the air. With a half smile, she leaned closer and made a small joke, something only the two of them could understand. Elton laughed softly through tears. For a brief moment, the weight of loss lifted, and the two friends who had once danced at Windsor Castle were once again side by side, bound by the same laughter that had first brought them together. Neither of them knew it then, but that small exchange at Gianni Versace's funeral would be their last conversation, the final spark of warmth before the darkness that was waiting just around the corner. The words of comfort that came from her lips at that exact moment weren't the kind one might expect at a solemn funeral. They were pure Diana. Elton later remembered her looking at him through the haze of grief and whispering, "God, I'd love a polo." They both laughed softly, and for that fleeting instant, pain gave way to familiarity. Sorrow turned into warmth, and their friendship was reborn. They made plans to meet again soon, to laugh, to talk, to finally rebuild what time and pride had taken away. But fate had a crueler script. Just 6 weeks later, that meeting would never happen. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Elton was jolted awake by the mechanical hum of his fax machine. A message had come through, only a single sentence. "So sorry to hear about this awful news." He rubbed his eyes, confused, and turned on the television. The words on the screen froze him in place. Princess Diana, his friend, his confidant, had been killed in a car crash in Paris. The images blurred in disbelief. The twisted wreckage inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the flashing lights, the chaos, the unbearable truth. She was gone. Just weeks earlier, they had held hands at Gianni Versace's funeral, promising to see each other again. Now she was another name on the news crawl, another tragedy in a world that refused to let her live in peace. "It felt unreal," Elton said later. "I kept thinking this can't be true. She was just here. We were laughing." Days later, the Spencer family called him with a request that would define the rest of his life. They asked him to perform at her funeral. Together with his longtime lyricist Bernie Taupin, Elton reworked his 1973 song Candle in the Wind, originally written for Marilyn Monroe. The new version began with the words that would echo through history. "Goodbye, England's rose. May you ever grow in our hearts." On September 6, 1997, under the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, before cameras broadcasting to nearly 2 billion people around the world, Elton John sat at the piano. His hands trembled as the first notes rang out. This wasn't a performance, it was a farewell. "For 4 minutes," he recalled, "the world was watching me. But it wasn't about me, it was about her." The world cried as he sang. Outside the Abbey, people stood shoulder to shoulder, holding candles and roses. It was as if the entire planet paused to grieve one woman whose humanity had touched them all. The recording of Candle in the Wind, 1997, became the best-selling single of all time, selling over 33 million copies. Yet Elton never celebrated its success. "Why would anyone want to listen to it?" he once said quietly. It felt morbid. It wasn't a hit. It was a wound that never healed. For him, every note carried the memory of her laughter, her warmth, and the unspoken words they never had the chance to say. In the years that followed, Elton kept the promise he made to himself that day to protect Diana's memory and to look after her sons. When Prince Harry began facing the same kind of brutal media scrutiny that had once consumed his mother, Elton spoke out publicly. "I feel a deep sense of duty to protect Harry and his family from the press intrusion that led to Diana's death," he said. True to his word, he has remained close to both princes, often hosting them privately at his home in the south of France, away from the cameras that once defined their pain. Yet even as he found new purpose in advocacy and philanthropy, the ghost of that unfinished friendship lingered. Elton often reflected on the rift that had briefly separated them, the pride that had silenced two friends who loved each other like family. "If I could go back," he admitted, "I would have picked up the phone. I would have said, 'I'm sorry. Life's too short for pride.'" It was a confession born not of guilt, but of wisdom, the understanding that love, no matter how strong, can be fragile when left unspoken. He also reaffirmed what he had long believed, that Diana's decision to withdraw from his charity project had been influenced by palace pressure, a small but telling example of the unseen forces that shaped and ultimately confined her life. Their friendship was unlike any other, a royal and a rock star, two souls from opposite worlds bound together by the shared experience of loneliness, laughter, and longing for something real. Through Elton, the world saw a version of Diana that was never rehearsed or filtered, a woman who swore, laughed too loud, told inappropriate jokes, and hugged strangers without hesitation. And through Diana, Elton rediscovered compassion and purpose, becoming one of the world's most dedicated advocates for AIDS awareness and humanitarian work. Even now, decades later, when he sits at the piano and the lights dim, there's always a pause, a small sacred silence before the first note. In that quiet, he still hears her laughter. She proved, Elton once said, that kindness and honesty could exist in a world built on image. That's what made her unforgettable. Their friendship was built on truth, broken by pride and immortalized by a song. And though years have passed, The bond between the Rocket Man and England's Rose still flickers in the collective memory of a world that can't quite let go. For Elton, that flame burns quietly but eternally, like a candle that never went out. So what do you think, friends? Was their bond destiny, or simply two lost souls finding each other in the chaos of fame? If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends who shaped our world.